man rush. He's back, pumps, starts to run. Back of the end zone, touchdown, Heath Miller. Heath Miller has just tied Elbie Nickel for the Steelers' all-time receptions for touchdowns list among tight ends. How about that?
Well, isn't that clever of us to talk about both those guys in the same segment? You could hear in the background there is obviously a home game. Heath! They still do that for Jesse James, although now Jesse James is a Detroit Lion. By the way, he got over $6 million a year, Jesse James, from the Lions. Good for him. Good for him. A lot of money. I don't know if the Steelers wouldn't have paid that, but anyway. Elbie Nickel was listed as an end. Tight end really didn't exist until the late 50s, early 60s. There was no such thing. You had two ends. One generally was kind of a pass-catching guy. Another was sort of a possession guy. And a lot of teams would have a flanker back. And he was a halfback, but he was more a pass receiver. He'd line up in the backfield, but he was a deep threat. And that's the way the offenses were run back then. They were called just ends. There was no designation, wide receiver, split receiver, X, Y, that sort of thing. You were either an end or a flanker. Elbie Nickel was, in essence, a tight end, even though his description was he was just an end. He joined the Steelers in 1947 from the University of Cincinnati. He played with them and only them for 11 seasons. Last year was 1957. He was a Pro Bowl selection, 3-time Pro Bowl selection. Wasn't a big guy back in those days. People weren't that big. 6'1", about 205 pounds. That was it. Kentucky native. Went to Cincinnati. And had some excellent years. Remember now, number one, the Steelers weren't very good back then. I shouldn't have to remind old-timers or historians. They only played 12 games a year back then. So your totals were inflated, and they didn't throw the ball that much. In 1953, Elbie Nickel caught 62 passes, which was a ton back in those days. Just the way the game was played. And, oh, by the way, if you're wondering about his credentials, he also played defensive end. Not every year, but in 4 of the years he played with the Steelers, he also played some defense. Now, they had gone to a platoon system long before that, but if a guy could play, as late as 1960, Chuck Bednarik was playing both ways. Center and inside linebacker, middle linebacker. Elbie Nickel did some of that too. We had talked about him. In fact, I remember the very first meeting we had, we focused so much on the dynasty teams of the 70s, all those great players. But we also thought, there were some really terrific players before the 70s, even when the Steelers weren't very good in the 50s and 60s. Some of them, like Ernie Stautner and John Henry Johnson, automatically went in because they're in the Hall of Fame. But last year we put in Buddy Dial, who played I think their careers may have overlapped somewhat with Elbie Nickel. But we want to remember these guys, and talking about Elbie Nickel, Elbert Nickel, was a tremendous player. Game was different. Doesn't take away from how excellent he was. And I don't have to tell any Steeler fan how great Heath Miller was. They had some good tight ends. Eric Green for a short while. Mark Bruner was a decent pass-catching end. He was a much better blocker than he was a receiver. But he was, if you threw a ball in Mark Bruner's direction, he would catch it. But towards the end of his career, he didn't get open as often. Still was a good blocker. But the Steelers have never had a better combination tight end blocking and receiving than Heath Miller. Benny Cunningham, Randy Grossman, but nothing like Heath Miller. The Steelers got him really as kind of a fluke. They got him late in the draft in the first round out of Virginia. But the only reason that he lasted long enough to get there is that he had had an abdominal injury when he was a senior at Virginia. It destroyed a lot of his senior season. And so a lot of teams said, well, he's got that injury. We don't know. We don't know if we want to go there, take a chance on him. Well, the Steelers did. And what a dividend. Great blocker. He wasn't the first Steeler receiver, a tight end who could get down the seam, but he was the best that they've had. Vance McDonald's got that kind of capability, but Heath Miller was the first. I think I can remember one time that Heath Miller dropped the ball. That may seem like an exaggeration over a long career. I remember just one. It was at home. I don't remember who it was against. If you threw it near him, he'd catch it. Great teammate, great leader, quiet guy, didn't say much, but a great player. Certainly deserving of Hall of Honor status.